All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're diving into something I think we can all relate to on like a really personal level. Work. I mean, you do it, I do it. Everyone listening is probably either on their way to work, at work, or just got off work. So we all have opinions about it, obviously. We all experience it in different ways. But have you ever thought about like what philosophers have to say about work?
Yeah, it's one of those things that's so central to our lives, you
Yeah.
know? You almost forget to step back and think about the bigger picture. Like, what is it really all about beyond just punching the clock and getting a paycheck?
Right. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. We're going to put on our philosophy hats. So, to guide us through this, we're going to be looking at excerpts from a really fascinating entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's called Philosophical Approaches to Work and Labor. And let me tell you, this thing is dense.
It is, but it's also super insightful. It really digs into how some of history's greatest thinkers, from Aristotle to Marx and beyond, have wrestled with the idea of work, its value, how it should be organized, all that.
Exactly. So, our goal today is to break down some of these big ideas, make them accessible, and hopefully get you thinking about your own relationship with work in a totally new way.
Yeah, and maybe spark some interesting dinner table conversations along the way.
Absolutely. Okay, so to kick things off, let's start with the basics. Like, when we say work, what do we actually mean? It seems simple enough, but philosophers have actually spent a lot of time teasing out the nuances here. And one of the first things they do is draw a distinction between work and employment.
Right. Those two terms often get used interchangeably in everyday conversation. But, like, philosophically, they represent two different things.
Okay, so employment is pretty straightforward. It's when you're working for someone else. You have a boss, you get a salary, you've got that whole formal setup. But work is a broader concept.
Yeah, much broader.
Yeah.
Think about, like, a freelance artist or writer. They are definitely working, probably putting in a ton of hours, but they don't have that traditional employer-employee relationship.
Makes sense. Or like stay-at-home parents, that's a ton of work. But it's not paid employment in the usual sense.
Exactly. So work encompasses all these activities that are productive, that create something of value, even if there's no money changing hands in a formal way.
Okay, so we're starting to see how work is this big umbrella term. But then the question becomes, how do you even define work? The Stanford entry mentions everything from factory work to what they call grief work, the emotional labor of processing loss. So where's the common thread there?
Yeah, defining work is surprisingly tricky. And that's because the activities we classify as work are so diverse, right? You've got manual labor, intellectual labor, creative work, care work, all sorts of things. So pinning down one strict definition that covers it all is pretty much impossible.
So are we saying there's no single definition of work?
Well, some philosophers argue that work is more like a family resemblance concept, kind of like how different members of a family might share certain features without any one feature being present in everyone.
Okay, like you and your brother both have your dad's nose, but maybe you've got your mom's eyes and he's got your grandma's chin. Something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So different types of work share certain characteristics, but there's not one single defining feature that's present in every single instance of work.
Interesting. So it's more about recognizing these overlapping similarities rather than finding one perfect definition. But the entry does point to some recurring themes, right? Like something about a deliberate effort to produce something that benefits others.
Right. A lot of philosophical perspectives on work emphasize that it's about intentionally creating something of value, something that other people can use, enjoy, or benefit from.
So if you're building a house, writing a book, or even teaching a class, you're creating something that holds value for someone else.
Exactly. And the entry calls this creating objective value. It means the value exists in the thing itself, in the product of the work, whether that's a physical object, a service, a piece of knowledge. It's a value that can be judged, objectively by others.
Okay, so work is about producing things that have objective value for others. And this brings up a good point about how work is different from leisure. Because with leisure, it's more about the subjective value you get from doing it.
Right.
Exactly. Like, if you're reading a book for pleasure, the value is primarily for you. You're not trying to create something for someone else to consume. The enjoyment is subjective, personal.
Right. No one's paying you to read that book and enjoy it for them. So it seems like a key distinction between work and leisure is who primarily benefits from it. Work is directed outwards towards others, while leisure is more about the individual's own experience.
Yeah, That's a good way to put it.
Now, the entry brings up an interesting point about effort. Like, is physical or mental exertion a necessary part of work? I'm thinking of like a professional athlete who's at the top of their game, or a musician who gets lost in the flow of playing. Are those things still work, even if they don't feel like a struggle? This is where it gets a bit more nuanced. Some definitions of work do focus on the effort involved, the toil, even the unpleasantness. But as you point out, there are lots of examples of work that people find deeply enjoyable, even exhilarating.
Like that surgeon who loves the challenge of a complex operation, or a writer who finds writing to be a fulfilling creative outlet.
Right. So while effort and difficulty might be part of many work experiences, they don't seem to be the defining feature.
So if it's not always about effort, then what is it about? What makes those activities work even if they're enjoyable?
I think the key element, and this is something the Stanford entry touches on, is that even as those enjoyable work experiences, there's still a sense of being guided by the needs or desires of others.
Like even if that surgeon loves operating, they're still doing it for the patient's benefit. Their skill and focus are directed towards a specific outcome that someone else needs.
Exactly. And the same goes for the musician. Even if they love playing, they're probably playing for an audience or trying to express something that will resonate with listeners. There's still that element of intentionality, of creating something for someone else.
So it's not just about doing something you enjoy. It's about doing something you enjoy with the intention of producing something valuable for others. That's a subtle but important distinction.
Yeah, I think you've hit on a crucial point there.
Okay, so we're starting to get a better understanding of what philosophers mean by work. It's more than just a job. It's about creating objective value. It's often directed towards meeting the needs of others. But why does this all matter? Why should we care about what philosophers have to say about work?
Well, one reason is that it helps us understand the true value of work. And I'm not just talking about money here.
Right, there's
Okay.
got to be more to it than just the paycheck.
Of course. On a basic level, work has what's called exchange value. That's the material benefits it provides. Your salary, the profits from a business, things like that. But if that was all there was to it, if work was just a means to an end, then it would be something we'd probably try to avoid as much as possible.
And yet, we know that people who are unemployed often struggle not just financially, but emotionally and socially as well. It suggests that work provides something more than just money.
Right. It fulfills deeper human needs. For example, think about the social aspect of work. Most jobs involve interacting with other people. You build relationships with colleagues, you collaborate on projects, you become part of a team.
It's where you get that water cooler talk, those office friendships, even those work rivals.
Yeah, exactly. So work can be a place where you build a sense of community, a sense of belonging. Some philosophers argue that this social dimension of work is actually essential for a healthy society.
It's not just about the individual, it's about how work connects us to others.
Exactly. And beyond the social benefits, work also allows us to develop our skills and talents. It challenges us to grow and learn.
Like, you might start a job knowing how to do a few things, but over time, you pick up new skills, you master new challenges, you become more competent.
Right. And this process of development, this sense of mastery, can be incredibly rewarding in itself. It contributes to our sense of self-worth and accomplishment. And some philosophers, even those who are critical of how work is structured in our society, still see this aspect of work, this potential for self-realization, as something inherently valuable.
It's about being able to contribute something unique, to put your stamp on the world.
Exactly. And then there's the question of meaningfulness. A lot of us want our work to feel like it has a purpose, like it's contributing to something larger than just ourselves.
You want to feel like you're making a difference, right? Not just going through the motions.
Right. And this idea of meaningful work is something philosophers have spent a lot of time thinking about. Like, where does meaning come from? Is it something inherent in certain types of work? Or is it more about how the individual perceives their work?
I mean, you could have two people doing the same job, but one finds it incredibly meaningful while the other finds it totally soul-crushing.
Mm-hmm.
So is it the job itself or is it the person?
That's the question. And there are different philosophical perspectives on this. Some argue that meaningful work involves a certain level of autonomy, the ability to make decisions and shape your own work process. Others connect it to the idea of using your skills to their fullest potential or contributing to the well-being of others.
The entry even mentions Rawls, the famous philosopher, who argued that having meaningful work is essential for self-respect.
Right. He said that without meaningful work, people can start to feel like they don't have anything to offer, like they're not contributing to society in a meaningful way. And that can be really damaging to their sense of self-worth.
It's like your work becomes part of your identity in a way. And if that work doesn't feel meaningful, it can impact how you see yourself.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a connection there. And then there's the whole concept of the dignity of work. This idea that all work, no matter how humble or unglamorous, has inherent dignity.
Like, even if you're not a doctor or a CEO, if you're doing honest work, it deserves to be valued and respected.
Exactly. And this idea has roots in religious thought, but it's also been championed by figures like Martin Luther King Jr.
Hmm.
He famously said that all labor that uplifts humanity has dignity and importance.
That's a powerful statement. It suggests that work isn't just about earning a living, it's about contributing to the common good.
Right. But it's also important to remember that the concept of dignity can be used in a critical way too, like to point out when working conditions are unfair or exploitative.
So it's not just about saying all work is good, it's about ensuring that all work is done under conditions that respect the dignity of the worker.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the many potential benefits of work: the income, the social connections, the personal growth, the meaning, the dignity. But the Stanford entry doesn't shy away from the downsides either. It also explores the arguments against work, and specifically what it calls work-centered culture. Because let's face it, work isn't always a rosy picture.
Definitely not. And I think a lot of the critique isn't about being productive or creative or contributing to society. It's about the way work is often structured, particularly in modern capitalist societies.
Like, think about the classic image of the assembly line worker doing the same repetitive task over and over again. It's hard to see how that kind of work allows for much creativity or self-expression.
Right, and that's something that even Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, recognized. He was worried about the potential for the division of labor to lead to, like, dehumanizing work experiences.
So even some of the earliest thinkers on capitalism were aware of its potential pitfalls.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the contemporary critique of work builds on those concerns. The entry highlights a few key arguments against work, or this idea of a work-centered culture. One is what it calls goods not realized.
So even though work has the potential to provide all those benefits we talked about, that potential isn't always realized in practice.
Right. Many workers face low wages, job insecurity, a lack of recognition, and jobs that are boring and unfulfilling.
It's like the gap between the ideal of work and the reality of work.
Exactly. Another problem is what the entry calls internal tensions among work goods. Basically, it's this idea that the different things we want from work, the money, the meaning, the autonomy, often conflict with each other.
Like, you might have a job that's super meaningful but pays terribly, or a job that pays well but is totally soul-crushing.
Right. It's hard to find a job that ticks all the boxes. And then there are the unrecognized bads or costs of work. The time it takes away from other things, the stress and burnout, the potential for health problems.
Yeah, and we often don't factor those things into the equation when we think about the value of work.
And then there's the whole critique of the work ethic. This idea that we're morally obligated to work, that work is inherently virtuous, and that leisure or idleness are somehow bad.
Like, we're supposed to feel guilty if we're not working all the time.
Right. And some philosophers argue that this obsession with work has actually led us to devalue other important aspects of life.
Like spending time with loved ones, pursuing hobbies, just relaxing and enjoying life.
Exactly. So there's this whole philosophical debate about whether our current relationship with work is actually good for us.
It's a lot to think about. But it's clear that there are serious ethical and social implications to how we organize work in our society. And that leads us to the final section of the Stanford entry we're looking at today: justice and the politics of work. Because ultimately, how we think about work has huge implications for how we structure our society.
Absolutely. And this section dives into some really fascinating and often controversial topics like distributive justice. How should the benefits and burdens of work be fairly distributed across society?
Like, what's a fair wage? Who deserves what kind of job? How do we ensure that everyone has access to meaningful work?
Right. And there are different philosophical perspectives on these questions. Some argue for a purely market-based approach, where wages and job opportunities are determined by supply and demand. Others believe in a more interventionist approach, where the government plays a role in regulating the labor market and ensuring a more equitable distribution of resources.
So, like minimum wage laws, worker protections, things like that.
Exactly. But even those policies are debated, like how high should the minimum wage be? Should the government guarantee everyone a job? What about things like universal basic income? These are all big questions that philosophers are grappling with.
And then there's the question of contributive justice. Like, do we have a right to work? or even an obligation to work.
Right. The UN Declaration of Human Rights actually includes a right to work, but how that right is interpreted is up for debate. Does it mean everyone should be guaranteed a job? Or does it just mean people shouldn't be prevented from working if they want to?
And on the flip side, do we have a moral obligation to work, even if we don't need the money? Some people argue that if we benefit from the goods and services produced in society, we have a duty to contribute through our own labor.
Right. But others push back on that idea, saying that our current economic system isn't set up in a way that guarantees fair reciprocity. Like if you work your butt off and still can't make ends meet, is it really fair to say you have a moral obligation to work?
These are really tough questions,
Yeah.
and they get even more complicated when you start thinking about things like career choices. Like, do we have a moral obligation to pursue jobs that benefit society, even if it means sacrificing our own interests or passions?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's about balancing our individual desires with our responsibility to the larger community.
So there's a lot to unpack there. But one thing that really stood out to me in this section was the idea of workplaces as private governments.
Oh, yeah, that's a fascinating idea. It's from the philosopher Elizabeth Anderson. And she argues that many workplaces operate in a way that's very similar to how governments traditionally operate. You have this hierarchy, this power structure, where employees are expected to obey their superiors, often without much recourse if they disagree or feel like they've been treated unfairly.
It's like a mini dictatorship in some cases.
Right. And Anderson raises some really important questions about whether that kind of power structure is compatible with genuine equality and democratic values.
It's like, even if we have a democratic government, if we spend most of our waking hours in undemocratic workplaces, does that really matter?
That's the point. And the entry discusses some potential ways to address this imbalance of power in the workplace, like labor unions, which give workers collective bargaining power, and workplace democracy initiatives, which give workers more say in how their companies are run.
So instead of just having a boss who dictates everything, you have a more collaborative decision-making process.
Exactly.
And then, of course, we can't talk about justice and work without talking about gender. The entry goes into some depth on how work is often deeply gendered and how this has led to all sorts of inequalities.
Yeah, and this is a huge area of philosophical inquiry, like the undervaluation of care work, which is traditionally done by women and often unpaid or poorly compensated, and the persistent gender wage gap.
And then there's the whole issue of emotional labor, the work of managing your own emotions and those of others as part of your job, something that's particularly common in female-dominated professions.
Right. And this raises a whole bunch of ethical questions, like how much can employers demand of their employees emotionally? What are the potential consequences for workers' well-being? And how do we value and compensate emotional labor?
So it's clear that there are still a lot of challenges to overcome when it comes to creating a truly just and equitable world of work.
Absolutely. And the final section of the entry looks ahead to the future of work, particularly in light of automation and the potential for a post-work society. Like, what happens when robots can do most of the jobs that humans currently do?
Yeah, it's a question that a lot of people are thinking about these days. And it raises even more philosophical questions. Like, if we don't have to work to survive, what will give our lives meaning and purpose?
Right. Will we use our newfound freedom to pursue creative endeavors, or will we just end up bored and adrift?
And how will we distribute resources in a society where work is no longer the primary means of earning a living?
These are huge questions, and I think philosophy has a really important role to play in helping us answer them.
So it seems like we've just scratched the surface here, but hopefully this has given you a taste of the rich and complex philosophical conversation around work, and maybe it sparks some new ideas for you to ponder.
Yeah, I think the key takeaway is that work is so much more than just a job or a paycheck. It shapes our identities, our relationships, our values, and even the way we structure our society.
So as you go about your day, think about your own relationship with work. What kind of value do you derive from it? What are the challenges you face? And how might these philosophical perspectives help you navigate the world of work in a more thoughtful and intentional way? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.